Hi guys, I am your host, Webster Marimbika. With me here to discuss colonial heritage. Rob is a Zimbabwean archaeologist, much a botanist and geologist. He has been involved in heritage work in one way or the other for nearly 35 years. Rob is currently an associate researcher at the Natural History Museum of Zimbabwe. Welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. So, Rob, what is your understanding of colonial heritage? What rings a bell?
Yeah,
when we talk about colonial heritage?
I mean, colonial heritage is obviously a highly controversial topic. It covers many different facets, but let's simplify it and say that it probably deals with elements of our heritage over the last 150 years, let's say. That is elements to do with the advance of Anglo-colonization. I mean, we could go back earlier and we can bring in the Portuguese.
Okay.
And then, then we become increasingly complicated in time depth.
Yeah, I understand, Europe. Now, let's get to the part, the most interesting part. How does it affect the current generation?
Right, like I said,
in your own perspectives.
Colonial heritage is, especially in the context of Zimbabwe, is quite controversial. I don't deny it's probably controversial elsewhere, but obviously it deals with the advent of European domination of the landmass, of the area now in a colonial boundary called Zimbabwe. So basically it's the advent of Rhodesia, the whole formation of the Rhodesian state and the resistance to it. So when we talk about it, I know we're going to probably focus invariably, because of the things that go through the press, on the white element of this colonial history, the white element of this experience. But obviously there is the other element which needs to be brought together, and I would say hasn't in the past and still hasn't yet been resolved.
Okay, what is this element?
When we talk about colonial heritage in Zimbabwe, and I'm obviously speaking particularly from a museum's background, we're talking about a set of monuments, a set of statues, a narrative that had to do with the advance of colonization. So it's taken from a one-sided perspective of the European advancement. So it's generally a Western capitalist-oriented intrusion into the state. And so, especially during the Rhodesian era, this was celebrated because obviously the whole heritage issue is tied up with nation building and identity of individuals. So certain things were selected to commemorate the advancement of the colonial process. So we might be picking on, let's say, the places where the pioneer column came through. There might be a memorial. Or we might erect statues to certain colonial individuals like Rhodes or Coghlan, and have those at certain key points in the cities. Then other things with colonial sort of history, forts that are tied up with the 1896 uprisings, be they the Chimurenga in Mashona, portions of Mashonaland, or the Mvukela in the sort of central portion of Matabeleland. So you get the selection of things to celebrate this tradition, or even graves. I mean, obviously Malidizimo with the burial of Rhodes and others up there is part of that colonial narrative.
Okay, so we need a new way to reinterpret the heritage.
There are different ways, and I mean, this is currently very much being discussed across the world, with particularly the Black Lives Movement. The options are obvious. Either you can remove it entirely And the removal allows sort of like cleaning the slate, so reinventing a new landscape on which a new narrative can be built. And that is and I'm sorry, I believe that's a fairly emotive, short-term way of doing it, because yes, you can suddenly dump a statue into a pond, but does that ever really deal with the issues that that individual created in the past? So the hurt of slavery, and once you
No.
take the statue away, and I'm now quoting actually something that occurred in the Sunday newspaper here in Bulawayo a couple of years ago, when they were discussing the removal of Rhodes' statue in Cape Town. And I remember a prominent journalist saying the removal of Rhodes' statue here in Bulawayo in 1980, it had a major function. It was an important event, but it also effectively removed a element which the next generation could see and therefore part of the narrative. So in a sense, what he was trying to say is remove some things, your own black nationalist narrative can actually lose out. So I'm very much in the opinion that things like this shouldn't necessarily be removed. They can be relocated, or the context in which it occurs, the bigger area, can be reinterpreted and represented.
Yeah, I understand you, Rob, and I'm with you, because we cannot throw a statue into the water or into the lake and then think that
correct.
It goes away with the history. It actually takes it strips off that right of the future generations
Correct.
to
And
know
that
what was happening.
a big issue. And then once one starts removing one thing, where does one stop? Now, I'm speaking from Matabeleland, and I'm not going to enter into the politics, but you can imagine there'll be some in the Matabeleland nationalist movement who would say, well, when do we stop stripping away? When are Kalanga monuments no longer relevant? Or when Kalanga might say, when are Ndebele monuments no longer relevant? So it's not simply the colonial issue. Once one starts selecting and altering the landscape, who has the right to determine that narrative, and where does it stop?
That's really a big question, Rob, because
Thank you.
I understand where you're coming from.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
What are some of the major challenges that the Zimbabwean heritage has been facing generally?
I mean, it isn't only colonial heritage, but I mean, our biggest problem is funding, and possibly an interpretation of what constitutes heritage is something that we need to understand and consider. A lot of what is prescribed as heritage are physical things like ruins, rock paintings, forts, occasional graves, certainly war graves, the sort of heroes' acres. So those are all prescribed, but very often I'm wondering whether heritage in the physical isn't necessarily always valued here in African society. Now, just hear me out on this one. I'm wondering whether heritage isn't actually more to do with memory and the speaking and the relating of the past, as opposed to this very much Western idea of picking up bits and putting them in dusty drawers in museums. And this is a debate that we need to get into. And I know things like UNESCO, etc., have certainly transformed over the last 30 years with an increasing sort of non-Western perspective coming into that body. So funding is an issue, and commitment is an issue.
Yeah. That's true.
You know, our museums it has been flopped around between ministries, and our National Archives is a similar situation. It's another heritage body, and they're usually the sort of forgotten departments in those ministries. They are like at present, National Museums is in Ministry of Home Affairs, and you can well understand that there are other elements in that ministry who call the shots and get funding as a priority. You know, we are museums and archives are sort of forgotten at the bottom.
Yeah. Rob, you are an associate researcher at the Natural History Museum of Zimbabwe, right?
Correct. It simply means I assist them when called upon.
I mean,
I'm not employed.
Okay. Yeah. But how then, maybe you have a better understanding of how they operate with an act that was drafted long back and is not being revised.
Oh, no,
I
yeah.
mean,
Oh,
that
no,
doesn't
I
somehow
agree.
challenge.
The act is, oh gosh, I know the name of the act. I just can't even remember the date. It's so long ago. I mean, I think I was still at junior school at that time. The act has been
The National Museums and Monuments.
2515. It was drafted many years ago, because originally what happened in this country, there were actually two heritage bodies. There was the Monuments Commission and there was the museums, and they operated differently. In fact, if you go to our northern neighbor, you'll actually find that system still operates, that they're separate. And then they combined the two together and they had this act. Now, you are correct that we're still running by that old act, but it has been redrafted. And I have been part of that process and was asked to comment. And the issue has been primarily because since that process was initiated, our museums has been bounced from ministry to ministry. I mean, there was even a short while when there was a heritage ministry, and you know, this doesn't help by not having sort of clarity as to which ministry do you exist in, and who do you report to. So it is there. I know it has been set forward and it's come back. I mean, there were issues that needed to be clarified according to the state lawyers themselves. I mean, so it is being done. I just wish they would expedite the process.
Okay. You were about to say something before I intervened. What was it?
You're asking me to forget things, what I'm saying. But, you know, I am, okay, so I'm particularly interested in the idea of public education. So, okay, so yes, I'm a professional archaeologist, but I spent most of my life in education. And my biggest interest is trying to take ideas from museums and the ivory towers of the universities and bring them to the general public. It is the public's right to have it. Unfortunately, sometimes I'm afraid academia forgets that and either writes in a manner which is impossible for the layman to read, or, and this is a particular problem in Zimbabwe,
That's
they
very true.
publish overseas, outside. I know why it's done, because it's all to do with your CV and there's ranking as to which journals you publish in. But the average Zimbabwean does not have access to heritage literature, which is why your channel is particularly important and why I'm happy to support this sort of initiative. I have published various small booklets on a private basis, trying to cover heritage either of different parts of the country or various topics. I mean, I've just finished one on the rock art of Zimbabwe as a whole. It's only a simple text. It's not supposed to be an academic text, which is what I've been criticized for by the academics. I never intended to write for them. And we need to get out of the ivory tower. And that is my big issue.
Okay.
Let's generally get the public involved. And once the public is evolved and see things and start going to see, let's say, encouraged to go and see, let's say, Maladizimu, that is where Rhodes is buried, or to Ntambani, where King Mzilikazi is buried. Once they start going there, we need to present the materials which are easy to understand and present different aspects. We don't want to provide a glorified history of Cecil Rhodes. We need to present a balanced picture so people can come away with their own opinions, because all individuals, because we're individuals, we come from different perspectives, different cultures, different ages, different politics. But let's present something to give a bigger picture. Now, a really good example of this, I feel, is the recent development that we've had at Pupu. Now, Pupu is on the Shangani River, northeast of Lupani, and that is where Alan Wilson and his men were chasing King Lobengula, and they were killed on the north bank of the river. So it's a critical story in the Rhodesian narrative in terms of Rhodesian identity and nationalism. Now, that was marked by a very simple concrete obelisk with a plaque, which unfortunately was lifted a few years ago and is sitting in somebody's house in Cape Town, I found. But now, obviously, that was only really commemorating Alan Wilson. Now, hold on. This is a battle in which many people were killed. You can't have one side killing themselves. There were other people.
Yes.
And those people, those Ndebele people, from the regiments that were protecting the king, they were killed as well. They were not commemorated previously in the Rhodesian monument narrative. So what has happened is the museum has created. Now, they could have simply knocked down the old white memorial, but they didn't. What they did is they built like an arc of walls around it on which there are painted depictions of the battle scene. So now you've got, and there's bits of text, not too much, not necessarily the best text, I think, but it's there, and it provides visitors both perspectives, and you can come away with your own opinion. And people probably go there with their own opinion anyway. So, but we must provide both sides.
I understand you, Rob. So that's a narrative that you think is the best way to go about it.
Yeah,
that provides both sides of the story.
Yes, I do. So that's one element that I'm very much into. So, I mean, we could even push this further back and go back to something like Old Bulawayo, or even further back to Great Zimbabwe. There are multiple narratives that should be presented on these sort of sites. And we need to provide people the easy materials to allow them to come away and understand, or not understand. Well, that's the way it is. So that's one of my big sort of interests and focus. The other is very much an element of, and I'm seeing this at the moment, there is a growing interest by our, let's say, the next generations after the liberation struggle. We're talking about the Born Frees. There is this interest in the country. So during the Rhodesian era, we had a very set narrative. It wasn't monolithic, as I'm afraid some people indicate. There are various funny things that there were other subgroups that had different opinions. But with independence, that sort of Rhodesian history narrative was chopped out quickly out of the education program. For good reason, because we're talking about nation building out of a war. The net result is that a lot of the next generation, probably even almost the next one down, the Born Frees, are now getting to this sort of 30, 40-year-old age, which is an age where people start, their children are nearly out of school. They're beginning to think, well, what is this built environment I'm living in? They're seeing old buildings. They are becoming aware of or wanting to go on holidays to things like Victoria Falls. And there they see the statue of Livingstone. Or they might go, as I say, to Maladizimu, and there's Rhodes' grave. My big thing that I feel is, because you then have one side saying, oh, they need to be destroyed, etc. But you know what? I think for Black Zimbabweans, it is high time that these people, we need to almost take over those values. So those old buildings that, let's say, you see in Harare, or okay,
Yes.
I've just been in Gweru. There's some lovely old buildings in Gweru.
Yes, the hotel.
The hotel, and the stock exchange, and the magistrate's court, and the clock that sits in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
We need to now say that isn't any longer white man's heritage. White man's power and heritage is gone. This is our space. This is our area. We need to take it over and say, okay, this is it. This is the clock. It was put up to commemorate the donkeys that came up with the trek. But now it's part of our landscape. It is now ours. It doesn't belong to somebody now living, in the grave or in Australia. And celebrate your own setting. There are things, people who went into what have happened in the area of the clock in Gweru. Was there any nationalist trade unionist leader who was working in the area? What I'm saying is, take that narrative and absorb it into your own setting. It's I just get very annoyed with this idea of saying, let's just knock it down and let's put up a whole lot of modern buildings. And actually, those modern buildings are probably styled a la London Docklands or Shanghai, and that's not our culture anyway.
Yes. So instead of putting these buildings down, let's find a way, the best way to interpret it to our interest and to the general interest of the Zimbabwean community. That is what you're saying.
Correct. And I'm not talking about saying, let's keep them for tourists. Yes, some people can make money out of that. I'm saying, this is your built environment. This is Mutare. It's got this lovely old Methodist church, that very odd-looking Methodist church. It's tatty at the moment, and it's on the main street. And if I lived in Mutare, I would be fuming just to realize that this element of the whole city has built and had all its internal politics while this building was standing. I mean, it's seen everything. So we need to appreciate it and take it as your own.
Okay, that seems like a very good approach to heritage.
Yeah, controversial, I know.
Yeah, it's very controversial as well. Now, moving on, Rob, what are the benefits that you think stand at the end of a successful reinterpretation of this heritage?
The benefits of reinterpreting it ensures that the narrative is not manipulated by any one group, and that you allow people to overcome, to incorporate it into their own culture, so that we must stop this them, us, mine, theirs sort of divisions. And only that way will Zimbabwean community reform, re-weld itself from the fragmented nature that we seem to certainly be experiencing at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. But one more thing, though. And I feel you and me are in line, and we share the same sentiments on this one. What do you think should be done to reach everyone in terms of heritage literacy? How best can we reach everyone? Because I'm a university student. And I'll tell you this: we're only 12 in our class. We're the ones that are doing these BS in archaeology. 12 people, and the next class is about 6 people. It just shows me that very few people know about archaeology or cultural heritage or museums in Zimbabwe. How best can we reach them?
Well, obviously, I'm old, so I'm very much stuck in the old ideas of paper and booklets, and certainly this country used to have a very good museum service in terms of publishing little booklets and bits of literally one sheet of paper. When you got to Nalatali monument, that is a stone ruin near sort of nearish Gweru, they gave you a piece of paper that gave you a bit of background and information. But today, now, obviously, we've moved into a digital world, a world where things, the media, through this sort of podcast, through Facebook, through websites, can actually present it. I am still of the opinion that we should see a lot more non-political articles appearing in things like the Herald, the Chronicle, and the national newspapers, so that, yes, I accept that there are some authors that do that, and I cut them out on most weekends and stick them in a big file. But I'm afraid those newspapers have such a slow circulation and a very cynical audience, if I can put it that way. So I think a lot more publications and a lot more electronic discussions and showing people and giving people the option to discuss heritage, and not just the main things like the Great Zimbabwe's, the Dombasha rock paintings, the Rhodes grave, but go off into the lesser known parts of the country. There are some fantastic rock painting sites right up in northern part of Motoko. They are not well known by the general population. Yes, the local community know, and a couple of academics like myself might turn up once every few years. But surely these sort of things should be being promoted. And I don't see why places like Motoko couldn't almost create a campfire project using their heritage. But that now gets me onto very other, complicated stories.
About one of the things that I just been thinking about, the way that we pay attention to the bigger sites, those that are enlisted on the World Heritage List, and the way that we address these unpopular sites is very different. And if you say or mention something like Impali Rock Art Site or Insukamini Ruins, people would be shocked that they're even heritage sites.
Yeah, exactly.
But they do exist.
Yeah.
But no one is paying attention to them. We just keep on focusing on Great Zimbabwe.
Correct.
Kami, Matopo. We need to change that.
Exactly.
Hi, Rob. It was nice talking to you.
Nice talking
to you. Thank you so much.
Nice talking to your audience. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'll make sure that you get the link to this podcast once it's done.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir.